In the sacred halls of Florence's cathedral, silver coins fell like tears upon blood-stained marble. The date was April 26, 1478, Easter Sunday, and the most audacious political murder in Renaissance history was unfolding before the altar of God. Francesco de Pazzi, his dagger dripping crimson, had just delivered 19 fatal wounds to Giuliano de Medici, screaming words that would echo through the centuries, "Die, tyrant!" But as the young Medici's blood pooled around the scattered coins, a darker question emerged from the shadows of that unholy morning. How did a respected family of bankers, pillars of Florentine society, come to commit murder during the most sacred moment of Easter Mass? The answer lies buried in a single transaction made 28 years earlier, when desperation first whispered its seductive promises to an honorable man. This is the story of the Pazzi conspiracy. But more than that, it is the story of how one patriarch's fateful compromise became a generational curse that would consume everything it touched. Chapter 1. The World of Marble and Gold. Florence, 1450, 28 years before the bloodbath. Picture Florence in the year 1450, when the Renaissance bloomed like a golden flower in the heart of Tuscany. The city where Dante once walked in exile now pulsed with a different rhythm, the heartbeat of commerce, the whisper of silk against stone, the clink of florins changing hands in shadowy alcoves. Through these marble streets where art and avarice danced hand in hand, two names commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The Medici, those astute masters of political finance who had transformed banking from mere trade into high art. And the Pazzi, proud traditionalists whose ancient lineage traced back to the very foundations of the Republic. The Palazzo Medici rose like a fortress of prosperity, its walls adorned with frescoes that told stories of triumph. Here, Cosimo the Elder held court, dispensing loans that could topple kingdoms and forge empires. His methods were subtle, diplomatic, a whispered conversation in Latin that could reshape the papal treasury, a carefully worded contract that made kings into debtors. But across the city, in the equally magnificent Palazzo Pazzi, a different kind of power was stirring. Ancient power, desperate power, the kind that grows dangerous when cornered.
Jacopo de Pazzi, patriarch of his noble house, stood at his window that fateful morning in 1450, watching the Medici carriages roll past with their cargo of gleaming success. At 58 years old, Jacopo possessed the weathered dignity of old Florentine nobility. Silver beard, carefully groomed, eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of merchant princes, hands that had signed contracts worth more than most men's lives. Yet beneath that dignified exterior, a canker of resentment was growing. The Pazzi banking house, once the equal of any in Florence, was being slowly strangled by Medici influence. Political contracts that should have been theirs were diverted to the Medici coffers. Trade routes that had enriched Pazzi merchants for generations were now controlled by Cosimo's expanding network. The bitter irony was not lost on Jacopo. The Medici had grown fat on practices that the Pazzi, in their moral scrupulosity, had long rejected. while Jacopo's family maintained their reputation through traditional commerce, honest trade, fair exchange, clean profits. The Medici had embraced more creative interpretations of Christian law. For you see, in the year 1450, the practice of usury remained a mortal sin in the eyes of Holy Mother Church. The ancient prohibition was clear: quid sorti accedit, usura est. Whatever exceeds the principal is usury. To charge interest on a loan was to exploit the desperation of your fellow man, to profit from misery, to commit a sin that could damn your soul to the very flames of hell. The Church taught that money was barren. It could not reproduce like livestock or bear fruit like trees. Therefore, to charge interest on a loan was to demand payment for something that did not exist, to sell time itself, which belonged to God alone. This was the foundation of Christian economics, the moral bedrock upon which honest commerce was built. The Pazzi had honored this prohibition for generations. Their wealth came from legitimate trade: silk from the East, wool from England, spices from distant lands. They were merchants, not usurers. Their gold was clean. But clean gold, as Jacopo was learning, grew slowly in a world where dirty gold multiplied like plague rats.
Chapter 2. The Merchant's Plea. The Palazzo Pazzi, October 1452. The autumn rain drummed against the leaded windows of Jacopo's private study, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to echo the drumbeat of his mounting desperation. 2 years had passed since that morning of bitter reflection, and the Pazzi fortunes had continued their inexorable decline. On this particular evening, as shadows gathered in the corners of his oak-paneled sanctuary, Jacopo faced a crisis that threatened to shatter his family's honor forever. The ledgers spread before him told a story of mathematical certainty. Within 6 months, the Pazzi banking house would be unable to meet its obligations. Bankruptcy, disgrace, the end of a lineage that had helped build Florence itself. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, his voice heavy with the weight of impending ruin. The door opened to admit Giovanni Tornabuoni, a wool merchant whose family had traded with the Pazzi for 3 generations. But the Giovanni who entered that night bore little resemblance to the prosperous trader Jacopo remembered. His once fine clothes hung loose on a frame wasted by desperation. His eyes held the hollow gleam of a man staring into the abyss. "Master Pazzi," he began, his voice cracking like dry parchment, "I come to you in my darkest hour, as my father came to yours, and his father before him." Jacopo set down his quill, noting how the man's hands trembled as he removed his rain-soaked cap. "Speak plainly, Giovanni. What brings you here on such a foul night?" "The plague of bad fortune that haunts us all, my lord. The Medici have influenced the wool guild to alter the trade routes. My shipments from England have been delayed, then seized for inspection, then released so late that my buyers have found other suppliers." Giovanni's voice grew bitter. "Always the Medici's suppliers." The story was achingly familiar. Jacopo had heard variations of it a dozen times in recent months. Honest merchants systematically destroyed by the Medici's web of political and economic manipulation. "My warehouses stand empty," Giovanni continued, his desperation now naked in his voice. "My workers have abandoned me for Medici gold. My wife—" He paused, swallowing hard. "My wife has sold her wedding jewelry to buy bread for our children." Jacopo felt the familiar twist of anger in his chest. Another family destroyed by Medici greed. Another generation of honest traders ground beneath the wheels of their political machine. "I need a loan," Giovanni said, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. 500 florins, enough to purchase new stock directly from the English traders who dock at Pisa. I can bypass the Medici stranglehold, but I must move quickly. "And your collateral?" Jacopo asked, although he already knew the answer. "My shop, my home, my remaining inventory. It totals perhaps 300 florins at market value. I know it is not enough security for such a sum, but—" Giovanni fell to his knees, his pride finally shattered. "My family will starve, Master Pazzi. My children will die in the streets while the Medici feast on gold stolen from honest men." Jacopo stared at the broken man before him, seeing in Giovanni's desperation a mirror of his own family's plight. The mathematics were simple. A traditional loan was impossible. The collateral was insufficient, the risk too great. But there was another way, a darker way. "Rise, Giovanni," Jacopo said softly. "A Pazzi does not conduct business with men on their knees." As Giovanni struggled to his feet, Jacopo's mind raced through calculations of a different sort. 500 florins loaned at the traditional rate of no interest would likely be lost forever. But 500 florins loaned at 20% monthly interest. The thought struck him like a physical blow. Usury, the sin that damned souls, the practice that had made the Medici rich while keeping the Pazzi poor. Jacopo felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. The moment of reckoning had arrived, the choice between honor and survival, between moral righteousness and family preservation. God forgives the desperate, and I am a desperate man. Giovanni's face drained of color. 20% monthly? Master Pazzi, that would mean— He paused, swallowing hard, his voice trailing off as the mathematics struck him like a physical blow. "It means survival," Jacopo replied, his tone growing steadier with each word. "For both our families. The Medici have shown us that righteous men finish last in this world. Perhaps it is time we learned their methods." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming, as if the very heavens wept for what was about to unfold. Some prices must be paid. Some lines must be crossed. The question is whether you would rather die with clean hands or live with stained ones. Giovanni's internal struggle played out across his gaunt features, the war between principle and necessity, between damnation and starvation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the rain. I accept." Chapter 3. The First Coin of Sin. The contract was drawn by candlelight, its terms inscribed in Jacopo's careful script while the storm raged outside. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the old Jacopo de Pazzi, the man of honor, the Christian merchant, the patriarch who had maintained his family's reputation through generations of moral trade. As Giovanni pressed his seal into the warm wax, Jacopo felt a strange sensation, as if something vital had been severed inside him. The deed was done. The line had been crossed. The Pazzi had entered the shadows where the Medici had dwelt for so long. "The money will be delivered tomorrow," Jacopo said, already reaching for his strongbox. "Use it well, Giovanni. Both our fates now depend upon your success." But even as he spoke, Jacopo knew that success was not the true measure of what had been accomplished that night.
The first coin of usury had been earned, and with it a curse had been born that would consume his family for generations to come. As Giovanni departed into the storm, clutching the promissory note that was both salvation and damnation, Jacopo remained alone with his ledgers and his conscience. The rain seemed louder now, more insistent, as if the very elements protested against the sin that had been committed in that sacred space of family honor. He poured himself wine with trembling hands and raised the cup in a bitter toast to the empty room. "To necessity," he whispered, "and to whatever price we must pay for survival." The wine tasted bitter on his tongue, but not as bitter as the knowledge that he had just sold a piece of his soul for 500 florins and the promise of 20% monthly interest. Outside, Florence slept, unaware that one of its most ancient and honorable families had just taken their first step into the abyss.
Chapter 4. The Golden Multiplication. Florence, 1453 to 1465. Like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water, that first act of usury sent waves of consequence radiating through the Pazzi family's destiny. What began as a desperate measure to save one merchant's family soon transformed into something far more sinister, a systematic empire built upon the suffering of others. Giovanni Tornabuoni, blessed by fortune or cursed by necessity, managed to make his venture successful. The English wool arrived safely, buyers were found, profits were made. But the mathematics of usury are merciless. By the time Giovanni could repay his debt, the principal of 500 florins had swollen to nearly 800 through the compound growth of monthly interest. Jacopo watched with fascination and horror as the gold flowed into his coffers. 800 florins from a single transaction, more profit than 6 months of honest trade had ever yielded. The implications were staggering. Within months, word had spread through Florence's network of struggling merchants. The Pazzi, it was whispered, had become willing to make loans that other banks would not consider. Desperate men began to arrive at the Palazzo Pazzi under cover of darkness, their faces bearing the hollow look of those who had exhausted all honorable options. There was Marco, the silk trader, whose Medici rivals had sabotaged his shipments from Constantinople. Jacopo loaned him 700 florins at 25% monthly interest, secured against his family's ancestral home.
There was Pietro, the spice merchant, whose warehouse had mysteriously burned just days after he had refused to sell his business to a Medici front company. Jacopo offered him 1,000 florins at 30% monthly interest, knowing full well that the man was signing his own death warrant. One by one they came. One by one they signed. One by one they fed the growing beast of Pazzi usury with their desperation and their souls. Francesco di Pazzi, Jacopo's eldest son, initially protested against these unholy practices. At 30 years old, Francesco possessed the fierce pride and moral certainty of youth. He confronted his father in the same oak-paneled study where the first cursed contract had been signed. "Father, what are we becoming?" Francesco demanded, his voice tight with anger. "The merchants in the street cross themselves when they speak our name. They call us soul-eaters, devils in human form." Jacopo, now 59 and considerably richer than he had been 2 years earlier, looked up from his ledgers with eyes that had grown cold and calculating. "They call us successful, my son.
For the first time in a generation, the Pazzi name commands fear as well as respect. Fear born of sin is not respect, Father. It is a foundation of sand that will crumble beneath us. Will it? Jacopo gestured toward the walls of his study, now adorned with new tapestries, fine silverware, precious books. Look around you, Francesco. This foundation of sand has made us wealthier than we have been since your grandfather's time. We can afford to commission new frescoes, to host grand festivals, to marry you into the finest families of Florence. But Francesco was not so easily swayed. At what cost? Our souls? Our honor? Father, I have seen what becomes of those who cannot repay your loans. Marco, the silk trader, his family now lives in the streets because you seized their home. Pietro's children beg for bread while you wear robes bought with their father's misery. Jacopo's face hardened. The world is not a place for soft hearts, Francesco. The Medici have shown us this truth. They prosper because they understand that mercy is weakness, that honor is a luxury only the strong can afford. Then let us be strong in our honor, not in our greed. The argument that followed echoed through the palazzo, servants cowering in distant rooms as father and son clashed over the soul of their family. But Jacopo had tasted the intoxicating power of unlimited wealth, and he would not be turned from his chosen path. You will learn, he told Francesco, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. When you inherit this empire I have built, you will understand that sometimes survival requires us to embrace necessary sins. Francesco left that confrontation a changed man. The idealism of youth had been dealt a mortal blow, replaced by a bitter cynicism that would eventually flower into the violence that would stain Florence's cathedral with blood.
Chapter 5. The Curse Manifests. 1465 to 1475, the Years of Shadows. Success, as the Pazzi family discovered, could be its own form of damnation. The wealth flowed into their coffers like a golden river, but it carried with it a darkness that began to seep into the very foundations of their existence. The first sign of the curse came in the winter of 1465, when Jacopo's youngest son, Roberto, was found dead in his chambers at the age of merely 22. The official cause was fever, but those closest to the family whispered of suicide. Roberto had been discovered with one of his father's usury contracts clutched in his lifeless hand, tears still wet on his cheeks. The physician who examined the body, old Dr. Benedetti, confided to friends that he had never seen such torment etched into the features of the dead. It was as if the young master had seen hell itself before he died, the doctor murmured. Francesco's wife, Bianca, began to exhibit disturbing behaviors in the months following Roberto's death. Previously a woman of sharp wit and gentle demeanor, she became prone to fits of screaming in the night, claiming that the palazzo was haunted by the spirits of debtors who had died in poverty. "They stand at the foot of my bed," she would whisper to her husband, her eyes wide with terror. "The children who starved because their fathers could not repay your family's loans. They reach out with skeletal hands, demanding justice." Francesco, already tormented by his father's transformation into a predator of human misery, found his wife's madness to be the final straw. He began drinking heavily, frequenting the taverns where he would rail against the Medici with increasing violence. "They made us into monsters," he would slur to anyone who would listen.
Before Lorenzo and his cursed family, we were merchants of honor. Now we are devourers of souls, and our palazzo has become a tomb for the living." But the curse that had settled upon the Pazzi house was not content with claiming only the weak. It reached its tendrils into every aspect of their existence, turning their golden success into a prison of guilt and paranoia. Business ventures that should have been profitable collapsed without explanation. A shipment of silk from Damascus simply vanished between the port of Livorno and Florence. The merchants swore it had been loaded, but the cargo holds were empty upon arrival. A profitable investment in Flemish textiles turned to dust when the entire workshop burned down on the very day the goods were to be delivered. Even their social standing, seemingly enhanced by their newfound wealth, began to crumble in subtle ways. Invitations to the finest houses came less frequently. Marriage proposals for Francesco's sisters were withdrawn without explanation. The Archbishop himself, once a frequent guest at Pazzi celebrations, began to decline their hospitality. Jacopo, now in his 60th year, had grown paranoid and suspicious. He trusted no one completely, not even his own family. His study became his fortress, surrounded by ledgers that recorded every florin gained through usury, every soul purchased with compound interest. Late at night, servants reported he could be heard talking to himself, or perhaps to something unseen, about the price of power and the necessity of sin. His hair had gone completely white, not from age, but seemingly from some internal torment that consumed him from within.
Chapter 6. The Great Enemy. 1475 to 1477. The war begins. It was during these years of internal decay that the Pazzi family's external enemy crystallized into a form that would define their ultimate destruction. Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent by his admirers, had ascended to the unofficial leadership of Florence at the tender age of 21, following his father Piero's death in 1469. But Lorenzo was magnificent in ways that his predecessors had never been. Where his grandfather, Cosimo, had been cautious and diplomatic, Lorenzo was bold and charismatic. Where his father, Piero, had been sickly and introspective, Lorenzo was vibrant and commanding. He was a patron of the arts who could discourse with Michelangelo, a politician who could outmaneuver the wiliest senators, and, most dangerously for the Pazzi, a financier who understood exactly how to strangle his enemies without leaving fingerprints on their corpses. Lorenzo had been watching the Pazzi family's descent into usury with the patient attention of a cat observing a mouse in a trap. He understood that their desperate pursuit of wealth through unholy means had made them vulnerable in ways they could not even comprehend. The war between the families began subtly, as such wars always do among civilized people. Lorenzo used his influence with Pope Sixtus IV to raise questions about certain Pazzi banking practices.
Suddenly, loans that had been routinely approved by papal bankers began to face unexpected scrutiny. Interest rates that had been overlooked were now cited as violations of canonical law. Jacobo found himself summoned to increasingly uncomfortable meetings with church officials who asked probing questions about the Pazzi family's sudden prosperity. How had they managed to accumulate such wealth so quickly? Were they perhaps charging rates that exceeded canonical limits? Had proper documentation been maintained for all transactions? Each meeting ended with polite warnings and gentle suggestions that the Pazzi might wish to review their practices to ensure compliance with church teaching. But beneath the ecclesiastical courtesy lay an unmistakable threat: conform or face excommunication. Francisco, his madness now edged with a dangerous fury, began to see Medici influence behind every setback. When a major debtor died mysteriously before his loan came due, Francisco accused Lorenzo's agents of murder. When a Pazzi warehouse suffered another convenient fire, Francisco publicly declared it to be Medici's sabotage. "He seeks to destroy us," he told his father during one of their increasingly volatile meetings. "Lorenzo knows that our wealth threatens his monopoly on Florence's banking. He will not rest until the Pazzi name is ground into the dust." For once, Jacobo found himself in complete agreement with his son. The systematic pressure being applied to their operations was too coordinated to be coincidental. Lorenzo was indeed moving against them, using methods that were both subtle and devastating. The final provocation came in late 1477, when Pope Sixtus IV revoked the papal banking contract from the Medici and offered it to the Pazzi instead. It should have been a moment of supreme triumph. The Vatican's banking needs represented the most lucrative contract in European finance. But when the Pazzi attempted to assume the papal account, they found their path blocked at every turn by Florentine bureaucrats who suddenly discovered technical irregularities in their banking licenses. Permits that had been valid for years were now questioned. Tax assessments that had been settled were reopened for review. Lorenzo de' Medici, with the casual elegance that characterized all his actions, publicly expressed regret that the Pazzi seemed to be experiencing such difficulties with their paperwork. Perhaps, he suggested, with apparent sympathy, they might benefit from consulting with more experienced financial advisors. Advisors who, coincidentally, all happened to work for Medici banks. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation, and it drove Francisco de' Medici to the brink of homicidal rage.
Chapter 7. The Birth of Conspiracy. Winter 1477. The Palazzo Pazzi. In the depths of winter, as the wind howled through Florence's streets like the voices of the damned, the Pazzi family gathered for what would prove to be their final council of war. The great hall of their palazzo, once a place of celebration and joy, had become a tomb of shadows and whispered resentments. Jacopo sat at the head of the long oak table, his white hair gleaming in the candlelight like snow upon a corpse.
To his right sat Francesco, whose once handsome features were now carved into lines of bitter fury. To his left sat Archbishop Francesco Salviati, a man whose ecclesiastical robes concealed the treacherous heart of a conspirator and the unholy soul of a political assassin. "Gentlemen," Jacopo began, his voice carrying the weight of approaching death, "we face extinction. Not the clean death of battle, but the slow strangulation of political murder. Lorenzo de' Medici seeks to destroy not just our fortune, but our very existence." Archbishop Salviati, his pale hands folded in an attitude of prayer that mocked the sacred, nodded gravely. "His Holiness has expressed concerns about the Medici influence in Florentine affairs. There are those in Rome who would welcome a change in the city's leadership." "Speak plainly, Archbishop," Francesco snarled, his patience worn thin by months of careful maneuvering. "Does the Pope support action against Lorenzo?" "His Holiness cannot officially sanction violence, but he has made it clear that he would not mourn Lorenzo's departure from this world." The words hung in the air like incense from a black mass. They were discussing murder, not in the heat of passion, but with the cold calculation of businessmen planning a ghastly commercial venture. Jacopo felt a strange calm descend upon him. The last vestiges of the man he had once been, the honorable merchant, the faithful Christian, the loving father, finally died in that moment. What remained was something harder, darker, more necessary. "So, we are agreed," he said simply. "Lorenzo de' Medici must die." Francesco's eyes blazed with unholy fire, and his brother Giuliano with him. "As long as any Medici draws breath, our family will never know peace." "The logistics will be complex," Salviati murmured, already deep in planning. "Lorenzo is well guarded, always surrounded by allies. We would need to catch him at a moment of vulnerability." "Easter Sunday," Francesco said, suddenly, the words emerging from some dark inspiration. "During High Mass at the cathedral, the entire city will be there, including Lorenzo and Giuliano. They will be focused on the service, surrounded by crowds, unprepared for violence." Jacopo stared at his son, seeing in Francesco's face a reflection of his own transformation from merchant to monster. "You propose to commit murder in the house of God during the most sacred service of the Christian year?" "I propose to do what is necessary for our family's survival," Francesco replied, his voice as cold as January wind. "The Medici have made their choice to destroy us. We merely respond in kind." Archbishop Salviati, that walking contradiction of holy office and unholy ambition, nodded slowly. "There is a certain poetic justice to it. They have profaned the sacred nature of Christian commerce through their unholy practices. Perhaps it is fitting that their punishment should come in the most sacred of places." And so, the plan was born in blasphemy and nurtured in hatred. As the winter wind rattled the windows of the Palazzo Pazzi, 3 men sat in conspiracy, not just against their enemies, but against the very foundations of Christian civilization itself. They had sold their souls for gold, and now they would pay for those souls with blood.
Chapter 8. The Cathedral of Sin. April 26th, 1478, Easter Sunday. Dawn broke over Florence like a wound in the sky, streaking the marble facades with blood-red light. In the Palazzo Pazzi, Francesco stood before his mirror in the pale morning light, adjusting the ceremonial dagger concealed beneath his finest doublet. His reflection stared back at him with eyes that had long since ceased to recognize their owner. Across the city, in the magnificent Palazzo Medici, Lorenzo and Giuliano prepared for Easter Mass with the casual confidence of men who ruled their world. They had no reason to fear this holiest of days, no cause to suspect that death waited for them in the house of God. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore rose above Florence like a crown of marble and dreams, its massive dome a testament to human ambition reaching toward the divine. As the morning bells called the faithful to worship, the cathedral filled with the flower of Florentine society. Merchants and nobles, artists and politicians, all gathered to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Among them moved the conspirators, their hearts heavy with unholy purpose. Francesco de Pazzi took his place near the altar, his hand resting casually on the hidden blade that would soon taste blood. Archbishop Salviati positioned himself where he could signal the other conspirators when the moment was right. Throughout the cathedral, hired assassins and paid allies waited for the sign that would transform Easter celebration into Easter slaughter. Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici entered the cathedral as they always did, with the confidence of princes and the bearing of men who had never known defeat. Lorenzo, now 29 years old and at the height of his power, nodded graciously to the assembled crowd. His younger brother, Giuliano, beloved by all Florence for his gentle nature and artistic patronage, smiled with the easy charm that had made him one of the most popular figures in the city. They took their places of honor near the altar, surrounded by friends and supporters, secure in their power and blind to the hatred that surrounded them like a poison mist. High Mass began with all the solemn pageantry that the Church could command. The Archbishop, not Salviati, who had disqualified himself from the service through his complicity in the coming violence, intoned the ancient prayers in Latin that echoed through the vast space like the voice of angels. As the service progressed toward its sacred climax, Francesco de Pazzi felt the familiar weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. This was the moment that would define his family's future. Either they would emerge victorious over their enemies, or they would die in the attempt. The moment of the elevation approached. That most sacred instant when the priest lifts the consecrated host toward heaven, when all heads bow in reverence, when the faithful believe that Christ himself becomes present upon the altar. It was to be the signal for murder.
Chapter 9. Blood on Sacred Stone. As the priest began the sacred ritual of the elevation, that most holy moment when bread becomes flesh and wine becomes blood, Francesco felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. Around him, the entire congregation bowed their heads in reverence, including Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. Hoc est enim corpus meum, the priest intoned, lifting the consecrated host toward the cathedral's soaring dome. In that instant, as the faithful believed Christ himself became present upon the altar, Francesco de Pazzi drew his dagger and lunged toward Giuliano with the fury of a man possessed. The juxtaposition was devastating. As the priest elevated the symbol of divine love and sacrifice, a son of Florence struck down his neighbor in hatred and vengeance. The most sacred moment of Christian worship became the backdrop for the most profane act of violence. What followed was not the clean assassination that Francesco had envisioned, but a frenzied butchery that would haunt the nightmares of all who witnessed it. The young Medici, caught completely off guard during his moment of prayer, barely had time to turn before the blade found its mark. In his rage and desperation, Francesco lost all control. Once, twice, 3 times the dagger fell. Then more, and more still, until he had delivered 19 wounds to the gentle Giuliano's body. "Die, tyrant!" Francesco screamed, his voice echoing through the cathedral like the cry of a damned soul. But even as he spoke, some part of him understood the bitter irony. In this sacred place, surrounded by images of Christ's passion, he himself had become the executioner. Above them, the priest still held the consecrated host, frozen in horror at the violence unfolding below. The body of Christ elevated towards heaven, while human blood pooled on the stones below, a tableau that would burn itself into the memory of everyone present. The attack on Lorenzo proved less successful. The older Medici, possessed of warrior's instincts honed by years of political combat, managed to avoid the initial assault and drew his own sword. Wounded but far from defeated, he fought his way toward the sacristy, calling for his guards and allies. In the space of moments, the cathedral erupted into chaos. Screams echoed from the marble walls as the assembled faithful realized that they were witnessing not worship, but warfare. Some fled toward the doors, others cowered behind pillars. Still others stood paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. Blood pooled on the sacred stones where Giuliano had fallen, mixing with the silver coins that had scattered from his purse in the violence. The symbolism was lost on no one. Here was wealth mingled with death, commerce stained with murder, the ultimate expression of what the Pazzi family had become. Francesco, his dagger dripping crimson, turned toward the sacristy where Lorenzo had taken refuge. But the moment of surprise was lost, the element of shock that had been crucial to their plan. Lorenzo's supporters were rallying, weapons were being drawn, and the tide of battle was turning against the conspirators. In that instant of realization, Francesco de Pazzi understood that they had failed. The conspiracy was unraveling, their support was melting away, and the righteous fury of Florence was about to descend upon them like the wrath of God himself. But it was too late for regret, too late for repentance, too late for anything except the consequences of the choices they had made in their long descent into darkness.
Chapter 10. The Wrath of Florence. April 27th, 28th, 1478. The Reckoning. The news of the cathedral attack spread through Florence like wildfire through dry wheat. Within hours, the entire city knew that the Pazzi had attempted to murder the Medici brothers during Easter Mass, the most sacred service of the Christian year in the most sacred space in Florence. The reaction was swift and terrible. Lorenzo de' Medici, wounded but alive, emerged from the cathedral sanctuary to find a city transformed by righteous fury. The Florentine people, who might have tolerated political assassination under normal circumstances, were horrified by the sacrilege of violence in God's house on the holiest day of the year. "Death to the Pazzi!" the crowd screamed as they surged through the streets toward the family palazzo. "Death to the blasphemers! Death to the murderers of the sacred!"
Francesco de Pazzi, his clothes still stained with Giuliano's blood, attempted to rally support in the city's political quarters, but he found only locked doors and closed shutters. The conspiracy that had seemed so carefully planned, so well supported, evaporated like morning mist before the sun of popular outrage. Archbishop Salviati, that unholy shepherd who had helped plan the slaughter, was dragged from his hiding place in the Palazzo della Signori and subjected to immediate trial by the city's magistrates. His ecclesiastical robes provided no protection against the fury of a people who had witnessed the desecration of their most sacred space. "You have violated every law of God and man," the chief magistrate declared, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "You have transformed the house of the Lord into a slaughterhouse, turned Easter into a day of blood. What defense can you offer for such unholy acts?" Salviati, stripped of his ecclesiastical dignity and facing the gallows, could manage only broken prayers. We sought only to free Florence from tyranny." "Tyranny?" The magistrate's voice rose. "You call this liberation? 19 wounds in an innocent man during the consecration of the Mass?" The archbishop fell silent, finally understanding that his political calculations had led not to power, but to damnation. Meanwhile, Jacopo de Pazzi faced his own reckoning. Found attempting to flee the city, something inexplicable had occurred during his escape. His horse had simply stopped at the city gates, as if frozen by an invisible force. "Why won't you move?" Jacopo was heard pleading with the animal. "We did what we had to do. We saved our family." But no amount of spurring could make the beast take another step. As the mob surrounded him, Jacopo seemed to be arguing with someone only he could see. "The debt must be paid," he whispered, his eyes fixed on empty air. Yes, I understand. The interest has compounded beyond all measure." The trials were swift, their outcomes certain. Francesco, his mind shattered by the magnitude of his crimes, raved about Medici conspiracies until his voice gave out. "Father," he called out as they placed the noose around his neck, "was it worth the price, the gold we gained for our souls?" Jacopo, facing his own execution moments later, looked out over the assembled crowd. "You think you are witnessing justice," he called with his final breath, "but you are seeing the final payment on a debt that began with a single coin."
Chapter 11. The Cleansing Fire. April 30th, 1478, 3 days after. In the aftermath of the executions, Florence undertook a systematic effort to erase the Pazzi family from existence. Their palazzo was seized by the city and given to Medici supporters. Their banks were closed, their assets confiscated, their business records burned in great bonfires that lit the sky with unholy flame. But it was the fate of their usurious gold that provided the most poetic form of justice. Lorenzo de' Medici, in a gesture that combined practical politics with symbolic righteousness, ordered that all coins and precious metals seized from the Pazzi estates be melted down and reforged into sacred objects for the cathedral. The very gold that had been earned through the sin of usury,
Those cursed florins that had started with Jacopo's first 20% monthly interest was transformed into chalices for the Mass, candlesticks for the altar, and most significantly, a great cross that was placed above the spot where Giuliano had fallen. Let this gold, once cursed by greed, now serve God through his sacred mysteries, Lorenzo declared as the new cross was installed. Let it remind all who see it that even the most tainted wealth can find redemption through divine grace. The symbolism was lost on no one. The Pazzi had sought to use their ill-gotten wealth to destroy their enemies, but instead it had been transformed into instruments of worship that would praise God for generations to come. The surviving members of the Pazzi family, those few cousins and distant relatives who had not been directly involved in the conspiracy, were banished from Florence forever. Their name was officially erased from all public records, their coat of arms chiseled from the facades of buildings they had once owned, their very existence denied by the city they had tried to destroy. Within a week of the failed conspiracy, it was as if the Pazzi had never existed. Their palazzos housed new families. Their business partnerships were dissolved, their political alliances transferred to Medici supporters. Florence had not merely defeated them, it had erased them from history itself.
Chapter 12. The Legacy of Shadows. Florence, 1480, 2 years after the blood. 2 years after the cathedral murders, Florence had returned to its normal rhythms of commerce and politics. The terrible events of that Easter Sunday had become a cautionary tale told in whispers, a reminder of what befell those who challenged the natural order of power. Lorenzo de' Medici, scarred but victorious, ruled the city with an authority that was now unquestioned. The attempt on his life had transformed him from merely powerful to legendary, a man who had faced death in the house of God and emerged stronger than before. But in the shadows of Florence's prosperity, those who remembered the Pazzi could still sense the lingering presence of their curse. Strange accidents continued to befall those who had profited from usury. Mysterious fires consumed the warehouses of moneylenders. Disease struck down bankers who charged excessive interest with uncanny frequency. The cathedral itself, despite the addition of sacred objects forged from Pazzi gold, seemed somehow different to those sensitive to such things. Visitors reported cold spots near the altar where Giuliano had fallen, whispers that seemed to echo from empty spaces, shadows that moved without apparent cause. An old priest, Father Benedetto, who had served the cathedral for 50 years, confided to friends that he sometimes saw figures standing near the altar during late-night prayers, translucent shapes that watched the services with expressions of infinite sadness. "They are the souls of those who died in debt to the Pazzi," he whispered. "The families who starved because they could not repay usurious loans. The merchants who lost everything to compound interest. They have come to witness the justice that was finally served." But perhaps the most telling sign of the Pazzi curse's persistence was what happened to their former palazzo. Despite being given to loyal Medici supporters, the building seemed cursed with misfortune. Its first new inhabitants, the wealthy Torrigiani family, lost 3 children to fever within a year of moving in. The second family, the Alberti bankers, saw their business collapse mysteriously within months of taking residence.
Eventually, the palazzo stood empty, its rooms echoing with memories of the family that had once called it home. Local children dared each other to run past its shuttered windows after dark, claiming they could hear the sound of counting coins and the whispers of ghostly accountants tallying the cost of souls. The building became known as Il Palazzo Maledetto, the Cursed Palace, and remained uninhabited for decades, a monument to the price of unchecked greed and the consequences of trading honor for gold.
Chapter 13. Echoes in the Marble. Florence, present day. The Eternal Warning. Today, nearly 5 centuries after Francesco de Pazzi's dagger found its mark in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, visitors to Florence can still trace the shadows of this ancient tragedy. The cathedral stands as magnificent as ever, its marble facade gleaming in the Tuscan sun, but those who know where to look can still find the marks left by that terrible Easter Sunday. There, near the altar, a small plaque marks the spot where Giuliano de' Medici fell. The inscription is brief, factual, giving no hint of the deeper darkness that led to that moment of violence. But the marble beneath the plaque is subtly different from the surrounding stone, slightly darker, as if stained by something that could never quite be washed away. The cross, forged from Pazzi gold, still stands above the altar, now green with age, but still gleaming in the candlelight. Few who see it realize that its precious metal was once cursed florins, earned through the sin of usury, transformed by fire and faith into an instrument of worship. In the shadows of Florence's narrow streets, the story of the Pazzi continues to be told, not as history, but as warning. Parents tell their children about the family that sold their souls for gold. Merchants whisper about the curse that falls upon those who profit from others' desperation, and bankers cross themselves when they pass the empty palazzo that once housed the most infamous family in Florentine history. The Palazzo Pazzi, when it finally found new inhabitants in the 19th century, was extensively renovated and blessed by no fewer than 3 priests. But workers renovating the building reported strange discoveries: hidden rooms filled with moldering account books, secret passages that led to chambers where the walls were covered with calculations of interest and debt, and most disturbing of all, a small room beneath the main hall, where the stones were carved with what appeared to be tally marks counting souls rather than florins. Modern Florence, with its bustling tourist trade and contemporary banking industry, might seem far removed from the world where usury was considered a mortal sin. But the story of the Pazzi serves as an eternal reminder that some prices are too high to pay, some wealth too cursed to enjoy, and some sins too dark to escape their consequences. In the Florentine night, when the last tourist has departed and the cathedral stands empty beneath the stars, locals still report strange phenomena: the sound of coins falling on marble, whispers in medieval Italian echoing from empty spaces, shadows that move independently of their supposed sources. Perhaps these are merely the tricks of imagination, the natural result of contemplating such dark history in such atmospheric surroundings. Or perhaps they are something more: the lingering presence of those whose greed transformed them from respected merchants into cursed conspirators,
forever bound to the scene of their greatest sin.
In the end, the Pazzi tragedy stands as an eternal warning about the treacherous mathematics of moral compromise. Jacopo de Pazzi's first act of usury had seemed reasonable, even necessary, a single transaction to save his family from ruin. But that initial coin earned through exploitation became the foundation of their ultimate destruction. The curse that consumed the Pazzi was not supernatural, but inevitable, the natural consequence of choices that compounded like the very interest they charged. Each ethical violation paved the way for greater transgressions, until Roberto lay dead from guilt, Francesco murdered in God's house, and their family name was erased from history itself. In the shadows of Florence, where the shadow tome preserves these dark memories, the Pazzi stand as testament to an unchanging truth. There are prices no fortune should ever pay, and victories that cost more than any defeat. Their gold, once cursed by greed, was transformed at last into sacred vessels for the cathedral, a final accounting that balanced blood with blessing, sin with redemption. The lesson echoes still through marble streets. Beware the seductive logic of necessary compromise, for the first step onto that unholy path is never the last.